Ricki was about to introduce himself, which is my dream of like emceeing a conference and then introducing myself and then popping in again and go hello. So I've taken that away from him because I want to do it first. Alright, so Mr. Ricki Burke is a very good friend of mine, and I think a lot of us around here, especially around in the information security industry, know him quite well. Because I'm going to not read your bio, just go full tilt. He's one of those industry recruiters that actually cares about the industry itself, and he kind of comes onto these things. He's running BSides Gold Coast, which has been postponed until February, March next year on the Gold Coast, if you want to get some sunshine. And he's one of those guys that just is really embedded in the community and within the industry as well, and just an all-around good person. But I'll read his bio. So Ricki is the founder of CyberSec People, helping organisations in Australia and the US build and scale security teams. A keen contributor to InfoSec's community and involved as a co-organiser of BSides Gold Coast, Sec Talks Gold Coast, host of Hacking Into Security podcast, and a speaker at a number of BSides conferences. It makes me very happy to actually introduce Ricki and take the opportunity right from him. Thanks, Ricki. Have a very warm round of applause for Mr. Ricki Burke.
I'll introduce myself tomorrow then. Okay, so welcome to the talk of the Hiring Managers Cheat Sheet. So really want to talk, I won't bother doing the intro, I'll do a bunch of stuff. So this talk is really two main things. It is more geared towards hiring managers, but I think it is helpful perspective of people in the industry just to hear and see what other people are also thinking, because not everyone always wants to talk about things like money and other things. But essentially, we as a business help organisations hire, but a really big thing is about helping our customers retain their staff as well. So retaining staff is a challenge, as every hiring manager probably knows, because there's a lot of opportunities out there. But if we understand essentially what people's interests are, what their motivations are, then we have a bit of a chance of actually keeping people. And some organisations, if I'm honest, do this much better than others. But my role in the industry, running a recruitment business in the cybersecurity space, we help companies hire, that's the job. But essentially what we do is, and it sounds really weird and cheesy, but we connect people to the right organisations, or at least that's the intention, but we're matching people to essentially what their motivations are. It's really important what we understand someone's why. What is their motivation? How can we help them achieve change from here to here? And essentially what I wanted to do was do what we do from a business perspective of understanding those things, those intrinsic motivations, and just do that at scale. So what I basically done over the last couple of months, and very rushed the last 2-3 weeks, was message a lot of people across the cybersecurity space in Australia. So essentially, this is a survey of about 200 people, security professionals in Australia, asking them essentially a few questions, and the feedback is what's in this presentation. Right, so just to give you a bit of an idea, it's a pretty not bad representative of across Australia. Unfortunately, we don't have full representation because certain places like Northern Territory don't really have much, unfortunately, in terms of cybersecurity. But yes, if this was true reflective, there'd be a few more in New South Wales compared to Victoria, but overall we've got a good mix of people across the country. In terms of the domains, and this is one of the things that's really important to understand, is cyber is not one thing. Cyber is many, many different things, lots of domains, lots of areas of the industry, right from leadership through to the different specializations. And this is the thing that a lot of, there's experienced people here, but there's subdomains within the domains. So when we look at things like security engineering, there are 10 plus types of security engineers. There are really vague titles, and that's a whole other conversation and topic, but essentially what I just want to represent, or at least show, that there is a pretty good mix of people in this survey as well, that hopefully, again, gives good representation. So a few questions were asked, and one of the most biggest changes that we've seen over these last 2-3 years is remote working. So I've been doing this job a long time. Remote working wasn't really a thing even 3 years ago. COVID has sucked in so many ways. In a positive way, it has had some good changes. One of those things is remote working. So whether we like it or not, we're all forced to work remotely, especially those of us in Victoria, which really, there's a lot of mental scarring there. But essentially, remote working, and now we're in this weird situation of things are opening up again and reality is resuming. And some organisations have gone all in with remote working, some organisations are still figuring their shit out. And it's a really weird place because I know that in some of the maybe more bigger organisations, large enterprises, there's pressure from big government or local governments to get their people back in the CBD, back spending money to essentially support the local economy. You've got that going on. You've got managers that are wanting to essentially get their team together for various reasons. Some people literally are just against remote working, and then you've got employees, which a lot of them are not interested in going back. They've had the taste of remote working, and some don't want to go back. And what I wanted to understand is, on a scale of 1 to 10, how important is remote working? So I find a lot of these stats interesting. That's my observation. Hopefully you will as well. So nearly 40%, 10 out of 10, that's how important remote working is. Essentially between the scale of 8 to 10, it's around 73%, or so 77%. But you can see essentially after 8 out of 10, it really drops off. So for nearly 80% of people, that's how important remote working is. Now, there's organisations out there offering different styles of work. Remote working, hybrid working, and then there's those companies that are trying to force people back into the office, and it's a real weird place. And I can't make this clear enough. As someone who, again, talks to people about why they could be open to a role, if they have a choice of a company that's remote, a company that's 3 or 4 days in the office, 99% of the time they're going to go for the remote role, or at least very heavy hybrid. If you're a hiring manager that is being forced to bring your people back into the office, good luck, because there's plenty of companies that essentially will take your staff. And the thing is, compared to 3, 4, 5 years ago, you're now competing with much larger and international businesses that are essentially paying a lot higher salaries and offering remote work. And this is also where you need to understand about motivations, because that's hard to compete with. You may not be able to compete with money, you may not be able to compete with other things, so you sometimes have to be more creative as well. But essentially, a lot of people still want to work remote. I've got to say, I really found this interesting. So naturally, a lot of people won't say their motivation is money, it's other stuff. Essentially what we find is they're expecting a salary increase when they're moving jobs. It just depends on what salary increase. So when we work with people, I don't care what someone's salary is. It's about what are you looking for? What do you need to move jobs? Because sometimes I have these weird scenarios where companies do ask what salary is the person on, and I don't care, because we're not asking the person to move for the salary that they're currently on, because it's very rare for anyone to do that these days. But essentially, just getting into the mindset of, like, the market's crazy out there. As we're in Seek all-time job adverts recently. It's interesting in terms of how many people are applying for jobs. But essentially, what are people looking for? So, even I was surprised that nearly 40% of people want a 21% increase or more when moving jobs. So, in my opinion, if you'd asked me before the survey, I would have said maybe sort of 10 to 15%. So I was really surprised it's that high. And there's some interesting sort of dynamics, which I'll jump into on the next slide, in terms of when you look at the data and dig deeper, you'll find, again, people's motivations do differ. Sometimes there's a real conflict of people saying one thing and then saying something else. So for any hiring manager out there, as you know, people are looking for a lot of money. That's not going to change. But All I can say is good luck with that. And what is interesting is there's one particular area which I'll go into, which is expecting more money than other areas. So, yeah, people want a lot of money, which we are aware of, but again, even for me running a recruitment business in this space, I'm surprised how much of an increase people want. So, just be aware, basically. This was the interesting thing. So, pen testers, you've got a lot to answer for there. I can see someone nodding their head in front. So, 72%, that was the highest out of all of the other areas, the other domains of security. It was the pen testers who wanted the biggest increase in salary. So, the pen testing space is pretty weird. You've had a lot of basically takeovers happen, a lot of mergers, acquisitions. The space is going through this transition phase of big companies, small companies being swallowed up, new boutiques being spun off the back of it. And it's not related to this talk, but I think it's helpful to understand as well that when we talk to a lot of people who break into this space, there's always the thing of, I'm a pen tester. It feels like 90% of grads or people in a transition want to be a hacker. What people don't realise is how few jobs there are in this space and how few companies actually have pen testing jobs. So we scrape Seek's data. We pay for someone overseas to scrape the data. I don't know if I should be saying that to Liv. Is that wrong? No. But essentially, we gather data. We then analyse that data, breaking down not just the job title, but the domains of security. And then we've got all these different domains. We understand what's actually happening. Are there trends happening in the industry in terms of how many jobs across the domains are there trends happening as well? And the interesting thing is when I look at the average of pen testing jobs, it's around 12%. So for all these people that want to be hackers, but only 12% of jobs essentially are in the pen testing space. And that's approximately, but there or thereabouts. You've got other areas like GRC, governance, risk management, compliance. You've got security operations and engineering. Those three spaces probably take up about 80% between them. So GRC alone is about 30%. So it's way bigger than pen testing. But it's just interesting when we break it down as well in terms of pen testing, there's only probably 50 to 60 odd companies across Australia where you could be a pen tester. And then when you break it down even further, it gets even smaller. But it's a weird space. But essentially we can look at hackers in the front and blame them. But anyways, it's just an interesting observation that salary expectations are high and they're not going away anytime soon. And this was another question. So as much as people want salary increases, or that could be a thing, how important is actually remote working? So would people actually move for the same job if they could do it remotely if they weren't offered it in the first place? So not quite an even split, but not far off. So it's interesting that essentially just under 50% of people would trade their job for a remote role if it was offered to them. So again, this is when I say for the hiring managers out there, try and bear this in mind that essentially you can lose people purely for the sake of remote working. And the better flexibility you can offer people, the more chance you've got of keeping people. And just some observations here as well. So in the GRC space, 65% wouldn't accept the same salary for a remote role, which I just found interesting rather than any particular commentary. And that was when nearly 90% wanted to work from home. So essentially, they want the salary increase and they want to work from home. Is what I'll take from that. And then the last one as well. So looking at the people that wanted a small increase, it just showed essentially their preference is actually to work from home, because that was a lot higher than essentially the other people in the space. But again, everybody's different. Some people work from home, some people don't. There is a takeaway from this, but essentially it is talk to your people. And then this was the big question. So we all have different motivations. So essentially, what would drive you to a new job in the next 6 to 12 months? And before I go into this, I just want to really emphasize that hiring managers will talk about the challenges of hiring. Like, I can't imagine any hiring manager saying it's easy to hire people. Now, the really interesting thing is job adverts, all-time highs, the applications, particularly in this space, are really low. So I think most managers will know that they're not going to attract the best people in general through a job advert. No offense. Is obviously job adverts work in different spaces, they'll work at different points in time, but essentially in a super niche space, which cybersecurity still is, still an emerging area compared to many more mature areas where demand is ridiculously high. People actually are open to jobs. So as far as I'm concerned, everyone's open to a job. It just depends on what the job actually is and what it looks like. So there were a number of responses, and it could be anything from promotion to new challenge to running flexibility, a salary increase. It could be working for a pre-IPO company where they're going to get equity in the business. It could be a diverse organisation. I found a really interesting one there where good co-workers have left. So that's a pretty good motivation. If all the good people have gone, then essentially that person's going to go as well. But essentially the results from that show 4 key drivers. So new challenge, impact, salary increase, promotion. Obviously that's not for everybody, but on the whole, that was such a, I guess these are the big responses that people are looking at. So it's really easy to be on this sort of treadmill that we're on sometimes in terms of our job, where it's just endlessly ongoing and there's always shit to do. But I think just being aware of the people in your team and really looking at them in terms of what their own goals are. Again, promotion, not everybody wants or is looking for promotion. If I'm honest, I feel like if we were in America, and again, no offense, but it was really interesting observing conversations in the US recently that people seem to be a lot more obsessed with careers and promo and the levels. Not only that they are, but also their colleagues and essentially what they're earning and what other people are earning. Australia seems a lot more chilled. That may change in the future, but at least for now, again, these are the main drivers. So when you're looking at your team, when you're doing reviews, when you're thinking about, again, hiring, but retaining people, look at the impact, look at where can you make a difference in that person's career? Why could that person be open? So new challenge, very vague term, but essentially it could be like new challenge could be an internal opportunity. It could be transition to another department, another team, learning new skills. It's a lot better to retain someone in your organisation doing something else than it is that person to go off and you lose that internal IP. But essentially, if you can try and focus on these things, then at least you can have a good idea of, or a better opportunity in actually keeping people. Final thoughts. I can't emphasize enough, the closer that you are to your team and their lives and their interests and their motivations, and Liam said it really well, if you care about your team, then yes, you could lose someone to a Google or Amazon who's just going to chuck crazy money at someone with ridiculous equity and or shares and different stuff. Sometimes there's not a lot you can do, but having a good culture is, I know it wasn't even actually on there, that no one actually said culture, which is really interesting, but money's important, all the other stuff, the culture, looking after your team, but understanding their situations, their well-being, and giving them a place where they can learn, develop. Sometimes there's not much more you can do, but as long as you know what they're looking for in the first place, you've got more chance of not just hiring someone, but actually keeping them in the first place. And that's it. Anyone have any questions?
Did you have a look at like secondary and tertiary reasons? Because people don't necessarily always know.
Yeah, I actually had some feedback from people. And that's the other thing, sometimes it's not just one driver. And if I'm honest with you, I wasn't given the option on my my survey to have multiple questions, but that was the feedback on a few times. So sometimes it's not just one thing, but again, it's a good observation.
Does data take into account any cognitive bias? I mean, people have a tendency to always overvalue their value.
Oh,
right.
People definitely overvalue their value sometimes.
Yeah.
And this is an interesting thing where, as a consultant, then we have the chance to have one-on-one conversations and sometimes offer a reality check or awareness. Because, yeah, I mean, that's just a survey. Like, again, it's data. Data is good as, as the data itself, essentially is context. But it's very interesting when talking to people sometimes and they have these expectations specifically around money where my question back is, okay, cool, but where does that come from? Where do your expectations come from? And it's because their friend over at X company is earning that, and okay, great, but you're not them, and this is not that company. So having to justify, not having to justify, but obviously it's a weird place right now. The salaries have gone nuts over the last 2-3 years. Obviously, there's loads of jobs and opportunity out there, but sometimes people just believe the hype, believe that, again, there's inflated stuff, and there needs to be some honest conversation sometimes of where that person's actually at in the industry.
Which, if I may, put you in the second
No, you may not.
Okay. The point I was trying to make was on that specifically, what does the industry think of that? I mean, the data says 21%, that's what I think I'm worth. But what actually, what's the reflected value in the market? Is there any, do you have any idea, what that might be at the moment? Like, what companies are willing to pay to meet that? I mean, do they stretch themselves to 21 or?
I think it's all relative, because the thing is, there'll be some people that, to be honest, they're underpaid compared to the industry. So there'll be people sometimes we work with where they say, I'm looking for X, and I have to say, no, actually, you can earn this.
Yep.
And unfortunately, without that awareness, they're clueless. And if it goes the other way around, sometimes people think the other way as well. And it's, unless you have someone to talk to sometimes, or at least other people to bounce the stuff off, but it's not easy to know where you're at as well.
So I think burnout is also one of the major factors.
Sorry.
So I think burnout is a really important topic in cybersecurity, and also comes mental health along with that. So I don't see anything on the survey even mentioning that. But what are your thoughts on people changing jobs for burnout or for hiring managers to retain people to ensure they're not burning out and retaining them?
It's a great question. People did have the option to add things, and that never came up. It wasn't even on the radar. But it's a real thing, especially people that work in maybe the IR space, where it could be intense, and you could have a manager that doesn't understand or doesn't give you the time off that you need after a ridiculous incident that happens. But it happens where people, they go through incident, burnout, and they're over it, and they're going to move jobs because shit happens. But it's how you deal with it after, or how you get looked after. And if they felt like essentially, I'm just doing the job and that's it, they're not being looked after by anyone else around them. They're not being supported. They know what's going to happen next time. So people talk. And it's a really small industry, and it's very helpful, but it's definitely a motivator, even though it wasn't actually mentioned. So I'll come to you. I'll do everything.
Unemployed.
So the recent changes in New York, some of the other US states with mandatory salaries on job ads, what are your thoughts if that spilled over into Australia? Do you think, what impact do you think it could actually have on the market there?
It's a good question. Transparency is not a bad thing. So obviously Microsoft, I think globally they're doing that. But it's not a bad thing, but I guess the challenge is not everybody can afford the salaries that Microsoft can offer. So obviously You're gonna make me run again, aren't you?
That's right. A number out there, and everyone's on that number, and everyone's making incredible money. If the reality is, now companies in New York, a lot of the bigger states, I think California's falling under it as well, are being forced to disclose actual salaries. Could that have a significant impact on where people reassess themselves and really where they see themselves and the motivators?
I'll just wait until you come back. Cheers, David. I think, thinking out loud, it actually sounds quite dangerous because people could feel like they're undervalued, or if they're earning good money, then great. But context is really important. And the thing is, just sort of relaying what I said there, not everybody can afford the salary of a Microsoft. And the thing is, there's obviously lots of different businesses out there. So for the SMEs out there that would never pay the same salary as one of these big FANG or tech companies, then what does that mean? Does that mean everybody wants to go and then work for those big companies? And that's not a nice thing, because generally, but then also impact was a big thing. People can have impact at these big businesses, but the reality is they can have a direct impact at a small organisation. And sometimes you'll get people that work at large businesses and their motivation is, I don't want to be a small cog in a big wheel, or vice versa. But essentially they want to go somewhere and in 2 or 3 years' time be able to reflect back on, I made a difference. So I don't know what to say on the money side of things. I think there's pros and cons. Transparency is really helpful because it might help in terms of benchmarking, but then it's really dangerous, I think, for the sort of SMEs out there, because if they start losing people to these other larger businesses, and that's a really sad situation. And then you'll get startups, smaller companies failing to come essentially off the ground because they're not getting the staff, because everyone wants a lot more money to go and work at a big business.